Section 1 of The Flood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Flood by Emile Zola. 1. My name is Louis Roubien. I am 70 years old. I was born in the village of Saint-Jory, several miles up the Garonne from Toulouse. For 14 years I battled with the earth for my daily bread. At last prosperity smiled on me, and last month I was still the richest farmer in the parish. Our house seemed blessed. Happiness reigned there. The sun was our brother, and I cannot recall a bad crop. We were almost a dozen on the farm. There was myself, still hale and hearty, leading the children to work. Then my young brother Pierre, an old bachelor and retired sergeant. Then my sister Agathe, who came to us after the death of her husband. She was a commanding woman, enormous and gay, whose laugh could be heard at the other end of the village. Then came all the brood: my son Jacques, his wife Rosie, and their 3 daughters, Emile, Veronique, and Marie. The first named was married to Cyprica Buisson, a big jolly fellow by whom she had 2 children, one 2 years old and the other 10 months. Veronique was just betrothed, and was soon to marry Gaspard Rabuteau. The third, Marie, was a real young lady, so white, so fair, that she looked as if born in the city. That made 10, counting everybody. I was a grandfather and a great-grandfather. When we were at table I had my sister Agathe at my right and my brother Pierre on my left. The children formed a circle, seated according to age, with the heads diminishing down to the baby of 10 months, who already ate his soup like a man. And let me tell you that the spoons and the plates made a clatter. The brood had hearty appetites. And what gaiety between the mouthfuls! I was filled with pride and joy when the little ones held out their hands toward me, crying, "Grandpa, give us some bread! A big piece, Grandpa!" Oh, the good days! Our farm sang from every corner. In the evening Pierre invented games and related stories of his regiment. On Sunday Agathe made cakes for the girls. Marie knew some canticles which she sang like a chorister. She looked like a saint, with her blonde hair falling on her neck and her hands folded on her apron. I had built another story on the house when Emile had married Cyprien, and I said laughingly that I would have to build another after the wedding of Veronique and Gaspard. We never cared to leave each other. We would sooner have built a city behind the farm in our enclosure. When families are united, it is so good to live and die where one has grown up. The month of May had been magnificent that year. It was long since the crops gave such good promise. That day, precisely, I had made a tour of inspection with my son Jacques. We started at about 3 o'clock. Our meadows on the banks of the Garonne were of a tender green. The grass was 3 feet high, and an osier thicket planted the year before had sprouts a yard high. From there we went to visit our wheat and our vines, fields bought one by one as fortune came to us. The wheat was growing strong. The vines in full flower promised a superb vintage, and Jacques laughed his good laugh as he slapped me on the shoulder. "Well, father, we shall never want for bread nor for wine. You must be a friend of the divine power to have silver showered upon your land in this way." We often joked among ourselves of our past poverty. Jacques was right. I must have gained the friendship of some saint or of God himself, for all the luck in the country was for us. When it hailed, the hail ceased on the border of our fields. If the vines of our neighbors fell sick, ours seemed to have a wall of protection around them, and in the end I grew to consider it only just. Never doing harm to anyone, I thought that happiness was my due. As we approached the house, Rose gesticulated, calling out, "Hurry up!" One of our cows had just had a calf, and everybody was excited. The birth of that little beast seemed one more blessing. We had been obliged recently to enlarge the stables, where we had nearly 100 head of animals, cows and sheep, without counting the horses. "Well, a good day's work," I cried. "We will drink tonight a bottle of ripened wine." Meanwhile, Rose took us aside, and told us that Gaspard, Veronique's betrothed, had come to arrange the day for the wedding. She had invited him to remain for dinner. Gaspard, the oldest son of a farmer of Morange, was a big boy of 20 years, known throughout the country for his prodigious strength. During a festival at Toulouse, he had vanquished Martial, the lion of the Midi. With that, a nice boy with a heart of gold. He was even timid, and he blushed when Veronique looked him squarely in the face. I told Rose to call him. He was at the bottom of the yard, helping our servants to spread out the freshly washed linen. When he entered the dining room where we were, Jacques turned toward me, saying, "You speak, father." "Well," I said, "you have come, my boy, to have us set the great day?" "Yes, that is it, Father Robien," he answered, very red. "You mustn't blush, my boy," I continued. "It will be, if you wish, on Sainte Félicité Day, the 10th of July. This is the 23rd of June, so you will have only 20 days to wait. My poor dead wife was called Félicité, and that will bring you happiness. Well, is it understood?" "Yes, that will do, Sainte Félicité Day, Father Robien." And he gave each of us a grip that made us wince. Then he embraced Rose, calling her mother. This big boy with the terrific fists loved Veronique to the point of losing his appetite. "Now," I continued, "you must remain for dinner. Well, everybody to the table. I have a thundering appetite, I have." That evening we were 11 at table. Gaspard was placed next to Veronique, and he sat looking at her, forgetting his plate, so moved at the thought of her belonging to him that at times the tears sprang to his eyes. Cyprien and Emile, married only 3 years, smiled. Jacques and Rose, who had had 25 years of married life, were more serious, but surreptitiously they exchanged tender glances. As for me, I seemed to relive in those two sweethearts, whose happiness seemed to bring a corner of paradise to our table. What good soup we had that evening! Aunt Agathe, always ready with a witticism, risked several jokes. Then that honest Pierre wanted to relate his love affair with a young lady of Lyons. Fortunately we were at the dessert, and every one was talking at once. I had brought 2 bottles of mellowed wine from the cellar. We drank to the good fortune of Gaspard and Veronique. Then we had singing. Gaspard knew some love songs in dialect. We also asked Marie for a canticle. She stood up and sang in a flute-like voice that tickled one's ears. I went to the window, and Gaspard joined me there. "Is there no news up your way?" I asked him. "No," he answered. "There is considerable talk about the heavy rains of the last few days. Some seem to think that they will cause trouble." In effect, it had rained for 60 hours without stopping. The Garonne was very much swollen since the preceding day, but we had confidence in it, and as long as it did not overflow its banks, we could not look on it as a bad neighbor. "Bah!" I exclaimed, shrugging my shoulders. "Nothing will happen. It is the same every year. The river puts up her back as if she were furious, and she calms down in a night. You will see, my boy, that it will amount to nothing this time. See how beautiful the weather is." And I pointed to the sky. It was 7 o'clock. The sun was setting. The sky was blue, an immense blue sheet of profound purity, in which the rays of the setting sun were like a golden dust. Never had I seen the village drowsing in so sweet a peace. Upon the tiled roofs a rosy tint was fading. I heard a neighbor's laugh, then the voices of children at the turn in the road in front of our place. Farther away, and softened by the distance, rose the sounds of flocks entering their sheds. The great voice of the Garonne roared continually, but it was to me as the voice of the silence, so accustomed to it was I. Little by little the sky paled. The village became more drowsy. It was the evening of a beautiful day, and I thought that all our good fortune, the big harvests, the happy house, the betrothal of Veronique, came to us from above in the purity of the dying light. A benediction spread over us with the farewell of the evening. Meanwhile I had returned to the center of the room. The girls were chattering. We listened to them smiling. Suddenly Across the serenity of the country a terrible cry sounded, a cry of distress and death. "The Garonne! The Garonne!" 2. We rushed out into the yard. Saint-Jory is situated at the bottom of a slope at about 500 yards from the Garonne. Screens of tall poplars that divide the meadows hide the river completely. We could see nothing, and still the cry rang out, "The Garonne! The Garonne!" Suddenly, on the wide road before us, appeared 2 men and 3 women, one of them holding a child in her arms. It was they who were crying out, distracted, running with long strides. They turned at times, looking behind with terrified faces, as if a band of wolves was pursuing them. "What's the matter with them?" demanded Cyprien. "Do you see anything, grandfather?" "No," I answered. "The leaves are not even moving." I was still talking when an exclamation burst from us. Behind the fugitives there appeared, between the trunks of the poplars, amongst the large tufts of grass, what looked like a pack of gray beasts speckled with yellow. They sprang up from all directions, waves crowding waves, a helter-skelter of masses of foaming water, shaking the sod with the rumbling gallop of their hordes. It was our turn to send forth the despairing cry, "The Garonne! The Garonne!" The 2 men and the 3 women were still running on the road. They heard the terrible gallop gaining on them. Now the waves arrived in a single line, rolling, tumbling with the thunder of a charging battalion. With their first shock they had broken 3 poplars. The tall foliage sank and disappeared. A wooden cabin was swallowed up. A wall was demolished. Heavy carts were carried away like straws. But the water seemed, above all, to pursue the fugitives. At the bend in the road, where there was a steep slope, it fell suddenly in an immense sheet and cut off retreat. They continued to run, nevertheless, splashing through the water, no longer shouting, mad with terror. The water swirled about their knees. An enormous wave felled the woman who was carrying the child. Then all were engulfed. "Quick, quick!" I cried. "We must get into the house. It is solid. We have nothing to fear." We took refuge upstairs. The house was built on a hillock above the road. The water invaded the yard, softly, with a little rippling noise. We were not much frightened. "Bah!" said Jacques, to reassure everyone. "This will not amount to anything. You remember, father, in '55 the water came up into the yard. It was a foot deep. Then it receded." "It is disastrous for the crops just the same," murmured Cyprien. "No, it will not be anything," I said, seeing the large questioning eyes of our girls. Emile had put her 2 children into the bed. She sat beside them, with Veronique and Marie. Aunt Agathe spoke of heating some wine she had brought up to give us courage. Jacques and Rose were looking out of a window. I was at the other with my brother Pierre, Cyprien, and Gaspard. "Come up," I cried to our 2 servants, who were waiting in the yard. "Don't stay there and get all wet." "But the animals?" they asked. "They are afraid. They are killing each other in the barn." "No, no, come up. After a while we'll see to them." The rescue of the animals would be impossible if the disaster was to attain greater proportions. I thought it unnecessary to frighten the family, so I forced myself to appear hopeful. Leaning on the window-sill, I indicated the progress of the flood. The river, after its attack on the village, was in possession even to the narrowest streets. It was no longer a galloping charge, but a slow and invincible strangulation. The hollow in the bottom of which Saint-Jory is built was changed into a lake. In our yard the water was soon 3 feet deep. But I asserted that it remained stationary. I even went so far as to pretend that it was going down. "Well, you will be obliged to sleep here tonight, my boy," I said, turning to Gaspard. "That is, unless the roads are free in a couple of hours, which is quite possible." He looked at me without answering, his face quite pale, and I saw him look at Veronique with an expression of anguish. It was 8:30. It was still daylight, a pale, sad light beneath the blanched sky. The servants had had the forethought to bring up 2 lamps with them. I had them lighted, thinking that they would brighten up the somber room. Aunt Agathe, who had rolled a table to the middle of the room, wished to organize a card party. The worthy woman, whose eyes sought mine momentarily, thought above all of diverting the children. Her good humor kept up a superb bravery, and she laughed to combat the terror that she felt growing around her. She forcibly placed Emile, Veronique, and Marie at the table. She put the cards into their hands, took a hand herself, with an air of intense interest, shuffling, cutting, dealing with such a flow of talk that she almost drowned the noise of the water. But our girls could not be diverted. They were pale, with feverish hands, and ears on the alert. Every few moments there was a pause in the play. One of them would turn to me, asking in a low voice, "Grandpa, is it still rising?" "No, no, go on with the game. There is no danger." Never had my heart been gripped by such agony. All the men placed themselves at the windows to hide the terrifying sight. We tried to smile, turned toward the peaceful lamps that threw discs of light upon the table. I recalled our winter evenings when we gathered around the table. It was the same quiet interior, filled with the warmth of affection, and while peace was there, I heard behind me the roaring of the escaped river that was constantly rising. "Louis," said my brother Pierre, "the water is within 3 feet of the window. We ought to tell them." I hushed him up by pressing his arm. But it was no longer possible to hide the peril. In our barns the animals were killing each other. There were bleatings and bellowings from the crazed herds, and the horses gave the harsh cries that can be heard at great distances when they are in danger of death. "My God! My God!" cried Emile, who stood up, pressing her hands to her temples. They all ran to the windows. There they remained, mute, their hair rising with fear. A dim light floated above the yellow sheet of water. The pale sky looked like a white cloth thrown over the earth. In the distance trailed some smoke. Everything was misty. It was the terrified end of a day melting into a night of death. And not a human sound, nothing but the roaring of that sea stretching to infinity, nothing but the bellowings and the neighings of the animals. "My God! My God!" repeated the women in low voices, as if they feared to speak aloud. A terrible cracking silenced the exclamations. The maddened animals had burst open the doors of the stables. They passed in the yellow flood, rolled about, carried away by the current. The sheep were tossed about like dead leaves, whirling in bands in the eddies. The cows and the horses struggled, tried to walk, and lost their footing. Our big gray horse fought long for life. He stretched his neck, he reared, snorting like a forge. But the enraged waters took him by the crupper, and we saw him, beaten, abandon himself. Then we gave way for the first time. We felt the need of tears. Our hands stretched out to those dear animals that were being borne away. We lamented, giving vent to the tears and the sobs that we had suppressed. Ah! What ruin! The harvests destroyed, the cattle drowned, our fortunes changed in a few hours. God was not just. We had done nothing against him, and he was taking everything from us. I shook my fist at the horizon. I spoke of our walk that afternoon, of our meadows, our wheat and vines that we had found so full of promise. It was all a lie then. The sun lied when he sank, so sweet and calm, in the midst of the evening serenity. The water was still rising. Pierre, who was watching it, cried, "Louis, we must look out. The water is up to the window." That warning snatched us from our spell of despair. I was once more myself. Shrugging my shoulders, I said, "Money is nothing. As long as we are all saved, there need be no regrets. We shall have to work again, that's all." "Yes, yes, you are right, father," said Jacques feverishly, "and we run no danger. The walls are good and strong. We must get up on the roof." That was the only refuge left us. The water, which had mounted the stairs step by step, was already coming through the door. We rushed to the attic in a group, holding close to each other. Cyprien had disappeared. I called him, and I saw him return from the next room, his face working with emotion. Then, as I remarked the absence of the servants for whom I was waiting, he gave me a strange look, then said in a suppressed voice, "Dead. The corner of the shed under their room caved in." The poor girls must have gone to fetch their savings from their trunks. I told him to say nothing about it. A cold shiver had passed over me. It was death entering the house. When we went up in our turn, we did not even think of putting out the lights. The cards remained spread upon the table. There was already a foot of water in the room. 3. Fortunately, the roof was vast and sloped gently. We reached it through a lid-like window, above which was a sort of platform. It was there that we took refuge. The women seated themselves. The men went over the tiles to reconnoiter. From my post against the dormer window through which we had climbed, I examined the 4 points of the horizon. "Help cannot fail to arrive," I said bravely. "The people of Saintin have boats. They will come this way. Look over there. Isn't that a lantern on the water?" But no one answered me. Pierre had lighted his pipe, and he was smoking so furiously that at each puff he spit out pieces of the stem. Jacques and Cyprien looked into the distance with drawn faces, while Gaspard, clenching his fists, continued to walk about seeking an issue. At our feet the women, silent and shivering, hid their faces to shut out the sight. Yet Rose raised her head, glanced about her, and demanded, "And the servants? Where are they? Why, aren't they here?" I avoided answering. She then questioned me, her eyes on mine. "Where are the servants?" I turned away, unable to lie. I felt that chill that had already brushed me pass over our women and our dear girls. They had understood. Marie burst into tears. Emile wrapped her 2 children in her skirt, as if to protect them. Veronique, her face in her hands, did not move. Aunt Agathe, very pale, made the sign of the cross, and mumbled paters and aves. Meanwhile the spectacle about us became of sovereign grandeur. The night retained the clearness of a summer night. There was no moon, but the sky was sprinkled with stars, and was of so pure a blue that it seemed to fill space with a blue light. And the immense sheet of water expanded beneath the softness of the sky. We could no longer see any land. "The water is rising! The water is rising!" repeated my brother Pierre, still crunching the stem of his pipe between his teeth. The water was within a yard of the roof. It was losing its tranquillity. Currents were being formed. In less than an hour the water became threatening, dashing against the house, bearing drifting barrels, pieces of wood, clumps of weeds. In the distance there were attacks upon walls, and we could hear the resounding shocks. Poplar trees fell. Houses crumbled like a cartload of stones emptied by the roadside. Jacques, unnerved by the sobs of the women, cried, "We can't stay here. We must try something, father. I beg of you, try to do something." I stammered after him, "Yes, yes, let us try to do something." And we knew of nothing. Gaspard offered to take Veronique on his back and swim with her to a place of safety. Pierre suggested a raft. Cyprien finally said, "If we could only reach the church." Above the waters the church remained standing, with its little square steeple. We were separated from it by 7 houses. Our farmhouse, the first of the village, adjoined a higher building, which in turn leaned against the next. Perhaps by way of the roofs we would be able to reach the parsonage. A number of people must have taken refuge there already, for the neighboring roofs were vacant, and we could hear voices that surely came from the steeple. But what dangers must be run to reach them! "It is impossible," said Pierre. "The house of the Rambaud's is too high. We would need ladders." "I am going to try it," said Cyprien. "I will return if the way is impracticable. Otherwise we will all go, and we will have to carry the girls." I let him go. He was right. We had to try the impossible. He had succeeded, by the aid of an iron hook fixed in a chimney, in climbing to the next house, when his wife Emile, raising her head, noticed that he was no longer with us. She screamed, "Where is he? I don't want him to leave me. We are together. We shall die together." When she saw him on top of the house, she ran over the tiles, still holding her children, and she called out, "Cyprien, wait for me. I am going with you. I am going to die with you." She persisted. He leaned over, pleading with her, promising to come back, telling her that he was going for the rescue of all of us, but with a wild air she shook her head, repeating, "I'm going with you! I am going with you!" He had to take the children. Then he helped her up. We could follow them along the crest of the house. They walked slowly. She had taken the children again, and at every step he turned and supported her. "Get her to a safe place and return!" I shouted. I saw him wave his hand, but the roaring of the water prevented my hearing his answer. Soon we could not see them. They had descended to the roof of the next house. At the end of 5 minutes they appeared upon the third roof, which must have been very steep, for they went on hands and knees along the summit. A sudden terror seized me. I put my hands to my mouth and shouted, "Come back! Come back!" Then all of us shouted together. Our voices stopped them for a moment, but they continued on their way. They reached the angle formed by the street, upon which faced the Rimbaud house, a high structure, with a roof at least 10 feet above those of the neighboring houses. For a moment they hesitated. Then Cyprien climbed up a chimney pipe with the agility of a cat. Emile, who must have consented to wait for him, stood on the tiles. We saw her plainly, black and enlarged against the pale sky, straining her children to her bosom. And it was then that the horrifying trouble began. The Rimbaud house, originally intended for a factory, was very flimsily built. Besides, the facade was exposed to the current in the street. I thought I could see it tremble from the attacks of the water, and with a contraction of the throat I watched Cyprien cross the roof. Suddenly a rumbling was heard. The moon rose, a round moon whose yellow face lighted up the immense lake. Not a detail of the catastrophe was lost to us. The Rimbaud house collapsed. We gave a cry of terror as we saw Cyprien disappear. As the house crumbled we could distinguish nothing but a tempest, a swirling of waves beneath the debris of the roof. Then calm was restored, the surface became smooth, and out of the black hole of the engulfed house projected the skeleton of its framework. There was a mass of entangled beams, and amongst them I seemed to see a body moving, something living, making superhuman efforts. "He lives!" I cried. "Oh, God be praised! He lives!" We laughed nervously. We clapped our hands, as if saved ourselves. "He's going to raise himself up," said Pierre. "Yes, yes," said Gaspard. "He is trying to seize the beam on his left." But our laugh ceased. We had just realized the terrible situation in which Cyprien was placed. During the fall of the house his feet had been caught between 2 beams, and he hung head downward within a few inches of the water. On the roof of the next house Emile was still standing, holding her 2 children. A convulsive tremor shook her. She did not take her eyes from her husband, a few yards below her, and, mad with horror, she emitted without cessation a lamentable sound, like the howling of a dog. "We can't let him die like that," said Jacques, distracted. "We must get down there." "Perhaps we could slide down the beams and save him," remarked Pierre. And they started toward the neighboring roof, when the second house collapsed, leaving a gap in the root. Then a chill seized us. We mechanically grasped each other's hands, wringing them cruelly as we watched the harrowing sight. Cyprien had tried at first to stiffen his body. With extraordinary strength he had lifted himself above the water, holding his body in an oblique position. But the strain was too great. Nevertheless he struggled, tried to reach some of the beams, felt around him for something to hold to. Then, resigning himself, he fell back again, hanging limp. Death was slow in coming. The water barely covered his hair, and it rose very gradually. He must have felt its coolness on his brain. A wave wet his brow. Others closed his eyes. Slowly we saw his head disappear. The women at our feet had buried their faces in their clasped hands. We ourselves fell to our knees, our arms outstretched, weeping, stammering supplications. On the other roof, Emile, still standing, her children clasped to her bosom, howled mournfully into the night. End of Section 1.